Okay, good morning. I think we're on session 8 today. They were having dinner. All right. Or is the goblin not worth protecting, too far beneath you? Her sudden flush betrayed her. He had been right. She hadn't even been thinking of the goblins as potential hostages. Huh. Maybe she wasn't as superior to him as she thought. He felt weirdly protective of the little green people, to his surprise. They were people, weren't they? They certainly had emotions like people. He had the nagging feeling that this was perhaps a very strange direction to take, one that wouldn't have occurred to him before, or apparently to her. She nodded, looking a little chagrined and thoughtful, and then, as she came around to the concept of the goblin as a person he had just threatened to ensure her good behavior, angry. This dinner, this dinner no longer seemed like such a good idea, but he didn't know how to bring it to a close. He wondered if maybe there was a treatise on hostage taking somewhere in that pile in the study. He'd clearly chosen a ridiculous name for himself and gone well out of his way to acquire trappings required to create a certain impression. No one stumbled on furniture as appalling by accident. His former self had put in quite the effort. Perhaps there was a guide somewhere to properly ruling with an ironclad fist. If so, he needed to find it as soon as possible before this lovely young woman destroyed him, either with wit or with his own cruelty. "Now," he said with a calmness he did not feel, "you are to be my guest for some time. I had planned to offer you certain privileges now that you've become more accustomed to that idea, but perhaps that must wait." She toyed with her fork. "What privileges?" "I thought to start perhaps with a few candles," he said. "Perhaps some writing materials or a book or two to while away the time." Surely he had some on topics other than magic or decorating with the skulls of his enemies. He worried about a lack of the swoony novels he'd expected her to prefer, but he had a somewhat different perspective on her preferences at this point. "With time, perhaps the occasional walk on the castle walls with me for air." "The first walk on your walls with you was quite enough, thank you," she said, looking down to stab a piece of steak that Beetle offered her with a rather more force than was required. It really was a surprisingly tender beef. He wondered what exactly had happened on that first walk to make her quite so bitter. He hoped he hadn't held her over the walls or something, but he shrugged as if it did not matter. "Your choice, of course. However, you would understand that I might have certain concerns." "Concerns?" Stab, stab. He sighed again. "Well, that you'll try and burn down the castle, or set yourself on fire, or write a devastating manifesto that will convince the goblins to revolt." That stopped her. "Would they read it?" "I'm not entirely certain whether they read," he confessed, relaxing slightly. "I admit it hasn't come up." "You seem to have an odd relationship with your goblins." He shrugged. "It's hard to hire good help." "When you keep setting them on fire?" "Perhaps I should reconsider some of my employment policies," he admitted. "And this is the part where you tell me that my beauty has convinced you to turn over a new leaf?" "Well, I haven't set fire to Beetle yet. Beetle, have I set fire to you?" Mumble, mumble. Beetle shook his head, his face carefully neutral and his eyes glued to a banner across from him. "There, see?" "Oh," said the princess, "and how long has," she stumbled over the name, "Beetle been in your service? A month? A week?" "Ah," he said intelligently, Beetle in particular has just arrived. But he's made very good start so far." "You'll forgive me if I remain unconvinced." She sat back, her eyes narrow. "What I do not know I do not know what game you are playing at, but I do not intend to play. What makes you think I am playing a game? Mentally, he begged her to tell him. What game had his real self started? You cannot treat someone like me in such a manner, sow terror and pain, and then try to charm your way as if you'd done nothing at all. It was a valid point, but something about it struck in his craw. Someone like you. So you mean if I had done it to some poor peasant girl, it wouldn't have been a problem? Of course it would have been a problem. There had been a slight hesitation there, though, where she had to adjust. But maybe poor peasant girls have done... maybe poor peasant girls you've done this to have been grateful enough afterwards for the pretty dress and fancy words not to mind. Oh, but fine ladies like yourself are too sophisticated to be taken in, he said. Privately, he suspected most women would be unwilling to be won over after such an introduction. A less privileged girl, though, might be more willing to play along and see what it got her. She didn't seem to hear the irony. Precisely. She stood. If we are done with this little mockery, I'd like to be taken back to my cell. He stood as well, looking at the remains of his dinner with some regret. If you'd like. I suspect a bit longer in the dark you'll feel differently. Guards. She kept her head held high as the goblins appeared at her elbow and marched her away. Stuck-up little bitch. He froze for a moment, uncertain where the thought had come from. His conscious mind couldn't remember any of the past that might have shaped his thoughts, but his emotions seemed to have no such problem. Like old habits, had worn channels in his mind, and the emotions still flowed through them naturally. He pushed that thought away for a moment. She was irritatingly proud, if it was a valid observation. He caught Garabeetle in his peripheral vision staring after her. His irritation rose in his throat. Out with you two, he snapped. Garabeetle started to scramble after them, like he had fireballs on his heels. Perhaps he was afraid he did. Gav slumped back in his seat. It was perfectly good steak, and it seemed a shame for it to go to waste. He had lost his appetite then, though. Was nice? Gav nearly leapt a foot in the air. The goblin from the kitchen was right next to his elbow. Behind her, the stones he would have sworn were solid had turned outward, revealing a secret passage, which she had probably assumed he had known about. Wonderful. How many more of those things were there? There was something different about her. He took a closer look. Great tear. Nope. He managed once again to stop before swearing that name and focused back on the goblin. She was still wearing her sackcloth dress, also cleaner than the last time he had seen it. But what was that over the top of it? Was that an apron? It had frills, it had flounces, it had an incredibly intricate and slightly amateurish cross-stitched flowers, and what might have been a kitten, a gamboling kitten. Except that the maker must have miscounted the stitches halfway through, and the kitten's face slid abruptly out of kilter to resemble a misshapen monster. Princess Light? The goblin count continued. She clutched her hands together, the claws rasping as she kneaded them anxiously. Don't startle me! At the sound of his voice, she jumped nearly as high as he had. He brought the volume down with an effort. Do you want to be fireballed by mistake? She shrugged fatalistically. We'll get fireballed eventually, but master satisfied? What kind of life did she have that she treated dying in a ball of fire as an inevitability? He didn't know anything about Goblin Society, he realized, or about how they had come to work for him in the first place. He could see why he'd chosen them, drippy noses and all, though. Humans did fatalism, but they tended to temper it with a bit more despair. Yes, I am satisfied. You did well. What was your name again? Her eyes widened in shock and then brightened. Orlak Shaperin Grinelelic Gararar, I am. He immediately regretted asking. Orlaka Spirengak. She ducked her head. Orla, master. He clutched at the name gratefully, feeling vaguely guilty for taking the easy way out. Orla. Anyway, yes. And, I see you found an apron. She looked up at him, eyes aglow, literally. He wondered if it was a feature of living in dark tunnels, or wherever it was goblins normally lived. Orla's granddaughter made. Could not wear, but master said to wear, so Orla can wear. Ah, yes. It's very, fetching. Do the other goblins have things they can't wear? Her eyes very wide, she nodded. Well, they may wear them, he said, and then he hurried to add, in the kitchen, not in the main hallways. It's important to keep a certain atmosphere, don't you think? He wasn't sure he was comfortable with the way she was looking at him, like he had given her a pile of gold and perhaps a box of sweetmeats. And then again, what was he doing asking her opinion? He needed to keep his mouth shut. The more he talked, the more trouble he would get himself into. The castle decor appalled him, but if goblins started appearing with jaunty hats and striped stockings or whatever caught their fancy, it would not improve matters. Carry on, he said roughly, and send someone to clean up this mess. If he hurried out, it was because he had important research to do. It was not a retreat. Let's see how we're doing on time. 11 minutes. Let's see how we're doing in the book. Is there a spot to stop anytime soon? Oh, yes, we're almost to a chapter. All right. The research impulse lasted only until he was out in the corridor. Then a wave of exhaustion washed over him. He stumbled his way back to his bedchamber, kicking off his shoes at the door, and collapsed face first into the surprisingly comfortable mattress. He didn't even have time for the serpent-tongued sirens adorning his bed to taunt him before sleep claimed him. And that's the end of the chapter.